It was just past noon on a Tuesday when Margaret Collins stepped into the diner, moving carefully, one hand resting against the door as if steadying herself before entering a room that had already decided whether it wanted her there. She was 82 years old, dressed neatly in a wool coat buttoned all the way to her neck, though the air inside was warm. The lunch crowd was thick, plates clattered, conversations overlapped, coffee steamed in heavy white mugs. She paused near the entrance, scanning the room the way someone does when they already expect the answer to be no. There was an empty chair by the window beside a retired couple. The husband glanced up, then quickly looked back down at his plate. The wife offered a tight smile and said softly that they were saving the seat. A booth near the jukebox had space, but the construction crew sitting there shifted their jackets across the bench before she could speak. In the corner, a young mother avoided eye contact entirely. Margaret nodded each time, polite, apologetic, as if she were the one inconveniencing them simply by existing. Across the room sat Jack Turner, 61 years old, broad shoulders softened by time, gray threaded through his beard, a worn leather vest with the insignia of the Iron Legacy Riders stitched across the back. He had come in alone, like he did most Tuesdays, ordered black coffee, and taken the table near the center where he could see the door. He watched the way Margaret moved, not just slow, careful. When she reached his table, she did not look directly at him. She kept her eyes lowered and asked in a voice that carried more hesitation than volume, "May I sit with you?" Jack did not smile. He did not make a show of generosity. He simply reached for the empty chair, pulled it out, and said one word, "Sit." In the next minute, he noticed things no one else had. The faint discoloration along her wrist, shaped more like fingers than like a fall. The way her coat remained fully buttoned, though perspiration gathered lightly at her temple. The subtle tremor in her hand as she reached for the menu. The fact that every few moments her eyes drifted toward the parking lot, as if measuring time against something unseen.
When the waitress set down coffee and toast, Margaret stared at the plate for a few seconds before touching it. Not confused, not forgetful, just uncertain, as if permission were required. Jack had spent years in the service before joining the Iron Legacy Riders. He had learned that fear leaves patterns. It shows up in posture, in breathing, in silence. He took a slow sip of coffee and waited. Margaret tried small talk first. The weather, the traffic, how long the diner had been there. Her voice was steady, but underneath it was something wound tight. Then, almost casually, she said, "I am not really supposed to be out today." Jack set his cup down. "Says who?" She hesitated. "My grandson, Andrew, he says it is not safe for me to go out alone anymore, that I might get confused." Jack met her eyes then. They were clear, sharp, not the eyes of someone lost. "Do you get confused, Margaret?" She held his gaze for the first time. No. That single word carried more truth than a long explanation ever could. In the United States, nearly 1 in 10 older adults experience some form of abuse, and financial exploitation is the most commonly reported. Yet experts estimate that only a small fraction of cases are ever formally brought to authorities. Most unfold quietly, behind closed doors, in homes that look respectable from the street. Jack did not know the statistics by heart, but he knew the signs of control. And control rarely announces itself as cruelty. It arrives disguised as concern. Margaret leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Andrew had a meeting this morning. I thought I had a little time, maybe 2 hours." 2 hours before what? Jack wondered. She did not answer. Instead, she reached into her purse for a napkin, and a small metal key slipped free, clattering softly against the tile floor. Jack bent down to pick it up. A storage unit key, tagged with a faded label, Pine Ridge Storage, Unit 47. When he handed it back, Margaret's fingers closed around it quickly, almost protectively. Then she looked toward the door again. "I should go," she said. "He will be back soon." She stood carefully, nodded her thanks, and made her way out into the daylight.
Jack remained seated, staring at the empty chair across from him. Something about the way she had said 2 hours did not sit right. Neither did the coat, or the bruise, or the look in her eyes when she said no. He had learned a long time ago that the worst harm does not come from strangers in dark alleys. It comes from people who speak calmly, dress well, and call their control protection. Jack finished his coffee slowly. Then he stood, knowing this was not just about a seat in a diner. It was about whether someone was willing to see what others chose to ignore, and he had no intention of looking away. When Jack left the diner that afternoon, he did not ride straight home. He took the long way, letting the steady hum of the engine settle his thoughts. He had seen enough over the years to understand that situations like this rarely begin with something dramatic. They begin quietly, gradually, one small decision at a time. Margaret Collins had not always moved like someone asking permission to exist. 14 years earlier, when her husband passed away from a sudden heart attack in their kitchen, she had grieved deeply, but she had not fallen apart. Friends from church brought casseroles. Neighbors checked in. She kept the house tidy, managed the bills, and continued attending Sunday service in the same pew she and her husband had shared for decades. She drove herself to the grocery store. She hosted coffee for 2 women from her quilting circle every Thursday afternoon. Her life was not loud, but it was steady, and it was hers. Andrew Collins returned to town 5 years ago. He was her sister's grandson, in his early 40s, clean-cut, articulate, and working in financial consulting. People described him as responsible, thoughtful, the kind of man who volunteered at community events and remembered birthdays. When he began visiting Margaret more often, no one questioned it. In fact, most people admired him. It started with conversations about safety. "Those stairs look steep, Grandma. What if you fell? That driveway gets icy in winter. What if no one found you for hours? The house is a lot to maintain. Would it not be easier to live somewhere with help nearby?" The questions sounded reasonable, caring even. Margaret had always prided herself on independence, but she was 82 now. Doubt can be planted gently. Andrew did not demand change. He suggested it. He framed every idea as protection. Within months, Margaret agreed to move into his home. He had recently renovated the property, he said. There would be space for her. It would give everyone peace of mind. The space prepared for her had once been a garage. It had been converted into a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a portable heater. The window was narrow. The walls were thin. Andrew explained that it would be temporary until further renovations were complete. At first, the adjustments seemed minor. Andrew offered to manage her finances so she would not have to worry about paperwork. He set up automatic deposits for her pension and Social Security benefits. He explained investment options she did not fully understand but trusted him to handle. Then he suggested she stop driving, not because she had caused an accident, but because he worried about other drivers. He kept her car keys in a drawer for safekeeping. Church became difficult. The walk from the parking lot was long. He said he would watch the live stream service with her at home instead. Phone calls with friends grew shorter. Sometimes he mentioned that they were busy. Sometimes he said they had not called. Gradually, the world beyond that converted room shrank. This pattern is not unusual. According to the National Council on Aging, financial exploitation is one of the most common forms of mistreatment affecting older adults in the United States. experts estimate that only 1 in 24 cases is ever formally reported. Most occur within families. Most are hidden behind explanations that sound practical. Control rarely arrives all at once. It tightens in increments. Andrew began collecting Margaret's mail directly from the box. He said it prevented confusion. He canceled her cell phone plan, explaining that she did not use it enough to justify the cost. If she needed to make a call, she could use his phone. Meals were brought to her room more often than shared at the table. Portions became smaller over time, though Andrew framed it as concern for her health. He mentioned what he described as doctor recommendations, even though Margaret had not attended an appointment in over a year.
When she questioned certain decisions, Andrew would respond calmly. He would remind her of her age, of moments when she misplaced her glasses or forgot where she set her purse. He never raised his voice. He simply repeated that he was trying to help. Over time, Margaret began to second-guess her own memory, not because she was incapable, but because repetition can wear down certainty. When enough people treat you as fragile, you begin to wonder if you are. By the time Jack Turner met her in the diner, the boundaries around Margaret's life had narrowed significantly. Access to transportation, access to communication, access to her own finances. Each piece had shifted quietly into Andrew's hands. To the neighbors, he appeared attentive. To the community, he appeared responsible. To Margaret, he appeared necessary. And that was the most dangerous part. Because when dependence is carefully constructed, it can feel like safety. But Jack had seen enough to recognize the difference between protection and possession. And the difference often begins with who controls the door. That evening, Jack rode straight to the Iron Legacy Riders Clubhouse, a modest brick building on the edge of town that had seen more conversations about responsibility than most people would ever imagine. He found Daniel Hayes in the back office, reviewing paperwork at a heavy wooden desk scarred by decades of use. Daniel was in his late 50s, steady-eyed, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Jack told him everything. The bruise, the coat buttoned too tight, the way Margaret watched the parking lot, the 2-hour window, the key marked Pine Ridge Storage, Unit 47. Daniel did not interrupt. When Jack finished, he asked only one question. "Do you believe she is in danger?" Jack did not hesitate. "Yes." "Then we look closer," Daniel replied. The next morning, they drove separately to Pine Ridge Storage. The facility sat behind a chain-link fence, rows of identical metal doors stretching across cracked pavement. Jack paid for access using the information Margaret had unintentionally revealed. When the door to Unit 47 rolled upward with a hollow rattle, the air inside carried the stillness of something preserved. The space was small, but organized. A folding table stood against the wall. On it were neatly stacked folders, each labeled in careful handwriting. Insurance documents, bank statements, property records. Jack lifted one folder and felt the weight of deliberate preparation. Margaret had not been confused. She had been collecting. Several life insurance policies had been updated within the past year. The listed beneficiary was Andrew Collins. Dates were highlighted, amounts circled in pen. There were copies of pension deposits showing transfers into an account Margaret did not recognize as her own. There were printed confirmations of online changes to account access credentials. There was a handwritten note folded inside a manila envelope that read, "If something happens to me, please look at these papers." Daniel exhaled slowly. This was not a misunderstanding. They continued sorting through the materials. Medical paperwork revealed scheduled appointments that had been canceled repeatedly.
prescription refill notices appeared for medications Margaret did not remember taking. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together it formed a pattern. In the United States, experts estimate that financial exploitation of older adults costs billions of dollars each year. Some studies place the number above $3 billion annually, while broader estimates suggest it may be significantly higher when unreported cases are considered. The common thread is trust. Most perpetrators are not strangers. They are relatives, caregivers, individuals with direct access. Daniel closed one folder and looked at Jack. "We need to verify everything before we involve law enforcement," he said. "Respectability can complicate these cases." Over the next 2 weeks, members of Iron Legacy Riders gathered information carefully. A retired accountant within their network reviewed public financial filings. A friend who worked in property records confirmed that Margaret's home had recently been transferred into Andrew's name through updated documentation. One evening, Jack rode past Andrew's house. From the street, everything looked orderly, the lawn trimmed, the porch light glowing. But when he circled slowly the second time, he noticed that the converted garage had a separate exterior door with a deadbolt positioned on the outside. The small window had metal bars installed, not decorative, but functional. It was not proof of wrongdoing on its own, but paired with the storage unit files, it raised serious questions. Daniel made a decision. They would not confront Andrew. They would not threaten him. Instead, they would make their presence known. Over the following days, whenever Andrew visited the bank, there was a motorcycle parked across the lot. When he stopped at the grocery store, a leather vest appeared in his peripheral vision.
At the coffee shop where he met clients, one of the riders sat quietly at a nearby table. No words were exchanged, no accusations made, just visibility. Pressure, when applied calmly, reveals character. Andrew began speaking more than necessary in casual conversations. He mentioned Margaret's supposed memory issues without being asked. He told a colleague that she had wandered recently, that he was concerned for her safety. He volunteered explanations that no one had requested. And someone noticed. Lily Carter, a waitress at the diner, had served Margaret several times over the past year. She remembered the way Margaret had slipped in alone on quiet afternoons, always glancing toward the door. One afternoon, months earlier, Margaret had pressed a $5 bill into Lily's hand and whispered, "If I stopped coming, it is not because I wanted to." Lily had dismissed it at the time, assuming it was worry. But when she saw the Iron Legacy Riders sitting in the diner more frequently, when she sensed something unspoken unfolding, she reconsidered. She approached Jack one evening after closing and told him what Margaret had said. That statement became the missing piece. With the documentation from the storage unit and Lily's account, Daniel contacted the appropriate authorities. Investigators reviewed digital records connected to Andrew's devices. They discovered online searches related to end-of-life procedures, estate processing timelines, and insurance payout requirements. Financial records showed recent adjustments to beneficiary designations and property transfers. 2 days after Margaret's lunch with Jack, Andrew had filed a report suggesting that she was prone to wandering and might become disoriented. To investigators, it appeared less like concern and more like groundwork. Documentation created in advance can shape future narratives. When authorities interviewed Margaret in a neutral setting, away from Andrew's home, her account aligned with the documents in storage. She spoke calmly, clearly. She described the gradual isolation, the reduction in access, the sense that decisions were being made for her rather than with her. Abuse thrives in isolation. It weakens when witnesses step forward. What began as a single word in a crowded diner had now become something far larger, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret Collins was no longer standing alone.
When Margaret sat down with investigators, she did not tremble the way she had in the diner. The room was quiet, neutral, nothing like the converted garage where she had been spending most of her days. Jack and Daniel waited outside, not to influence her words, but to make sure she understood she was not alone. She folded her hands in her lap and spoke slowly, choosing clarity over emotion. It did not begin harshly, she explained. Andrew never shouted. He never used threatening language. That was part of what made it so confusing. He always sounded reasonable. First, he suggested she stop driving. He said other drivers were reckless, and he did not want her hurt. Then he began managing her appointments. Over time, those appointments happened less and less. When she asked about seeing her doctor, he told her it was unnecessary, that she was doing fine. Her phone was disconnected under the explanation that it saved money and reduced distraction. He promised to be her point of contact. If anyone needed her, they could reach her through him. Mail stopped arriving in her hands. Andrew said he was organizing it to prevent clutter. Bank statements were replaced by brief verbal summaries. When she asked questions about her pension, he reassured her that everything was handled. Then there was the room. At first, she believed it was temporary. The converted garage had seemed practical. But the heater failed often during colder nights. She asked for additional blankets more than once. Andrew would nod and say he would take care of it. Sometimes he did, often he forgot. Meals were delivered on a tray. Portions gradually became smaller. When she mentioned still feeling hungry, Andrew responded that her metabolism had changed with age and that moderation was important. She trusted him at first. He worked in finance. He spoke confidently. He used language that sounded informed. Over time, though, she began to feel weaker, not because she was incapable, but because isolation can drain a person's spirit as much as any physical hardship. The lock on the exterior door had been installed, Andrew told her, for safety. He worried she might wander at night. Margaret told investigators she had never wandered in her life. She valued routine, yet the explanation was delivered so calmly that she questioned her own judgment. The hardest part, she said quietly, was not the restrictions, it was the erosion of credibility.
When Andrew told neighbors she was becoming forgetful, they began speaking to her differently, slower, louder, as if she had already declined. She felt herself shrinking under the weight of their lowered expectations. "I knew something was not right," she said. "I just did not think anyone would believe me." Her statement reflected a broader reality. Experts across the United States emphasize that many older adults hesitate to report mistreatment because they fear not being taken seriously. Dependence can create silence. So can embarrassment. So can the worry of disrupting family ties. Investigators reviewed the financial evidence alongside her testimony. Pension deposits had indeed been redirected into an account managed solely by Andrew. Property documents confirmed that ownership of her home had been transferred through legal mechanisms she did not fully understand at the time of signing. Insurance policies had been updated, naming Andrew as primary beneficiary. Charges were filed under statutes related to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, unlawful confinement, and fraud. The language was clinical, precise, but the impact was deeply personal. Andrew maintained that he had acted out of concern. He described himself as an overwhelmed caregiver trying to manage complex responsibilities, yet the documentation suggested planning rather than confusion. Adjustments to assets had occurred in sequence. Statements to coworkers about Margaret's supposed wandering had been made before any official inquiry began.
9 months later, in a courtroom filled with quiet observers, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Margaret did not celebrate. She did not appear vindictive. She simply closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled, as though a weight she had been carrying privately had finally been acknowledged publicly. For years, control had been presented to her as care. Now the distinction had been recognized for what it was. And that recognition restored something far more valuable than money or property. It restored her voice. After the trial, Margaret Collins did not return to the converted garage. She moved into a small residential care community 2 counties away, a place with wide hallways, sunlight that reached the floors, and a staff trained to listen before they acted. She was given her own room, her own key, and something she had not held in quite some time, her own phone. The first evening there, a nurse showed her how to adjust the thermostat.
Margaret stood quietly for a moment, hand resting on the dial, almost surprised that she was allowed to decide how warm she wanted the air to be. Freedom, at her age, did not look dramatic. It looked like small choices restored. Jack visited a week later. He brought nothing but time. They sat in the common room, watching late afternoon light stretch across the carpet. Margaret spoke more easily now. The tension that once tightened her shoulders had softened. She told him she had started painting again. Watercolors mostly, landscapes, open fields, long roads disappearing into distant horizons. She said she liked painting roads because they reminded her that direction still existed, no matter how long someone had been standing still. Every Tuesday after that, Margaret returned to the diner. She walked with a cane now, steady but deliberate. The limp had not disappeared entirely, but it no longer carried the same weight. When she entered, fewer eyes looked away. People recognized her. Some even stood to greet her. And at the center table, Jack Turner still pulled out the chair. Sometimes they talked about nothing in particular, the weather, local news, the taste of the coffee. Sometimes they sat in silence, which felt different now, not heavy, just peaceful. Margaret occasionally brought one of her small paintings rolled carefully in a paper tube. Jack hung them along the wall at the Iron Legacy Riders clubhouse. Scenes of highways at dawn, barns against golden fields, skies painted in soft blues and hopeful oranges. The men in leather vests never made speeches about what had happened. They did not frame themselves as heroes. They simply continued doing what they believed brotherhood meant, showing up. Across the United States, millions of older adults live independently, contribute to their communities, and maintain full control over their lives. Age alone does not define vulnerability. Isolation does. When connections narrow, risk increases. When community pays attention, risk decreases. Experts consistently emphasize that prevention begins with awareness, a simple check-in, a conversation, a willingness to notice subtle changes. Financial exploitation and coercive control often unfold quietly, but they rarely withstand collective attention. Margaret once asked Jack why he helped her that day. He thought about the question carefully before answering. "Because you asked to sit down," he said, "and I said yes." Sometimes justice does not begin in a courtroom. It begins in an ordinary place, at an ordinary table, with someone deciding that another person's presence matters. Margaret Collins did not need saving in the dramatic sense. She needed recognition. She needed someone to see the difference between care and control, between protection and possession. Her story is not about fear. It is about awareness. It is about dignity reclaimed. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reach out to someone you have not spoken to in a while. Ask a question. Listen to the answer. Small acts of attention can carry more weight than we realize. And if you believe stories like this matter, share your thoughts below. Let us know where you are watching from.
Conversations create connection, and connection protects. Because sometimes the most powerful word we can offer another person is simple. Sit.